Good, cool. So my name is Melanie Eley, and I'm the Web Accessibility Coordinator at UNC Greensboro, actually. And I've been working with WCAG for a few years. I've been here at UNC Greensboro for 3 years, and prior to that, I worked with WCAG and accessibility issues at Rockingham Community College. So when I first started out with WCAG, it was a little overwhelming because there's a lot of information out there. There's a lot of stuff. It's great information, but if you're just starting out, it can certainly be overwhelming to look at all of that information. So what I'm going to share today, I'm hoping it's some of the things that I've learned that made it a little easier to understand, and I'm hoping that it will help you guys as you're looking at excuse me, WCAG and trying to make your web content accessible. So before we get started, just want to, excuse me, just want to go over a few of the topics that we'll discuss today. First, we'll take a look at just a brief history and the meaning of WCAG. We'll also go over the setup of WCAG and kind of look at the different layers that are involved with WCAG, including the 4 principles of accessibility, and also how to decode the numbering system that WCAG uses. And we'll also take a look at some of the more common WCAG errors that tend to occur on web pages and websites, and how they affect certain users with disabilities. Also, most of the information that I'm going to talk about today is going to apply to content creators. And when we talk about content creators, we're talking about the people who are creating and sometimes posting content to web pages. So if you are creating or posting videos, audio recordings, if you are providing text content that's posted directly to a web page, images, documents, forms, if you are involved in any of those types of or similar types of web content, creating that type of content, most of what we'll talk about today in this session will apply to you. Okay, so we'll start at the beginning and talk about defining WCAG and also clarifying what it is and what it isn't. So starting with the acronym, WCAG, and most people say WCAG or WCAG, but it's an acronym, stands for Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. And so these are basically accessibility standards for web content that have been created and are currently maintained by the World Wide Web Consortium, which is also known as the W3C. And so the W3C is a leading voice in web accessibility, and it's an international community of a group of accessibility experts who have come together over the several years, numerous years, to specifically develop guidelines that will help to make web content accessible. And so these have turned into guidelines and recommendations that should be used, can be used when you're creating web content. As I said, WCAG has been around for quite some time. The first version came out in 1999. And initially there were 14 guidelines of accessible design. And those guidelines focused pretty heavily on the techniques for accomplishing accessibility within web content. And it also established the 3 levels of conformance, which we see as single A, double A, and triple A. And we still actually use these conformance levels in the current version of WCAG. So WCAG has evolved over the past few years. However, there was not an update to it until 2008. That's when W3 released the 2.0 version. And it did shift WCAG's focus from looking primarily at the techniques for achieving accessibility within web content and moved it more towards having guiding principles of accessibility. And the guidelines allowed for more flexibility and also encouraged more conceptual thinking during the web development process. So as you are building those websites and creating the content, those guiding principles allowed for a little more flexibility, focusing on overarching principles rather than those specific techniques or just the specific techniques to address accessibility. So also another update occurred 10 years later. In 2018, W3C released the 2.1 version. And this update was needed because technology had evolved and advanced and quite a bit had changed since 2008. And so W3C wanted to update those standards to make sure that the standards were in line and current with our technology. So currently, the W3C's official recommendation for accessible web content is version 2.1. 2.1 does build on the previous version 2.0 and expands 2.0, but it didn't really change anything from 2.0. All of the information that was there or the guidelines that were there in 2.0 still exist in 2.1. They did expand and added 17 additional success criteria, which focused more on accessibility within mobile devices. The majority of those criteria focused on mobile devices and accessibility there. And kind of need to go back just a little bit because I mentioned success criteria, but want to back up and explain. As I said, there are now 4 those guiding principles of accessibility, the core principles, and that moved from those 14 initial guidelines. So they reduced those 14 guidelines to the 4 core principles. And then within those core principles, you have 13 guidelines that are sprinkled throughout those 4 core principles. And then within the guidelines, you have several success criteria that can be met. The success criteria are the pieces of WCAG that provide the specific information about techniques, explanations about specific accessibility issues, whether it's something that you need to fix, or something that you want to consider as you are creating your content or building your sites. Also, as I said, 2.1 is the current recommendation. There is another update that will be coming soon. Version 2.2 is expected to be released sometime this year. So that will be likely be some additional information, success criteria that will be added to what we currently have in 2.1. So in trying to understand what WCAG is, it's also helpful to know what it isn't. I think one of the more common questions or things that you might get confused about, because you hear WCAG a lot, WCAG is referenced a lot with various accessibility issues and just in the topic of web accessibility. A lot of people think that WCAG is an actual law, and it is not a law. It's, as I mentioned before, it's a set of guidelines, a set of recommendations that are available for people who are creating web content to use to make sure that what they're creating is accessible. So it is not a law itself, but it is connected to several of our accessibility laws. So WCAG itself, there's no direct, penalty or punitive action that is directly aligned with WCAG. But if you're not following those WCAG standards, you do run the risk of being in violation of some of those accessibility laws, like the ADA, Section 504, and if you have web accessibility policies at your institution, not following WCAG could cause you to be in violation of your institutional policies as well. So like I said, WCAG is not a law, but it does help you to be to conform or be in compliance with the accessibility laws that exist. Okay, so now we're going to move into talking about the different pieces of WCAG. And just like an onion, WCAG has several layers, and you can peel back those layers and you get more details, more information, and you're able to dig deeper into how WCAG is made up. So as I mentioned before, there are 4 principles of accessibility. Those are the overarching guidance of WCAG. As you dig deeper, you peel back a layer, you'll find that there are those 13 guidelines that are organized within the 4 principles. And then if you dig even deeper, peel back another layer, you'll find that there are a total of 78 success criteria within those 13 guidelines. And the success criteria, as I mentioned, those are the things that you would likely refer to when you have a specific issue related to accessibility and making your web content accessible. That's kind of the success criteria, gives you the how-to and examples of how to fix or make sure that your content is accessible. So as I mentioned, there are 4 principles of accessibility, and they are represented by the acronym POUR. And POUR stands for Perceivable, Operable, Understandable, and Robust. So as you get more familiar with WCAG, you will see that acronym POUR quite often with WCAG. And as I said, it represents those 4 comprehensive or overarching principles of accessibility. And we will talk more about how or what each of these principles mean in just a few minutes. So within these layers of guidance that WCAG has, it does use a tiered numbering system to try to, I guess, identify and specify the different types of information that it contains. So you'll often see 3 numbers that are separated by periods when you're working with WCAG standards. And I have an example here on the screen that I'll talk about in just a second. So there are typically three numbers, 3 digits, 3-digit number, and that makes up a success criterion. As I said, the success criterion is what you would use to specifically target a specific accessibility issue. So the 3 numbers and the first 2 digits within that number represent the corresponding principle and the guideline. The 3rd number is going to be your success criteria. And altogether, these 3 numbers show that tiered structure to show how the success criteria are connected to the guideline, the principle, but also other success criteria and guidelines and principles within the entire WCAG system. Often you're going to use these to, as you're creating content, as you're building websites, and also just as importantly, as you are testing websites for accessibility. And so in the example that I've got here, there's the 1.1.1, which is the success criterion for non-text content. And so if we're kind of going back to our onion and layers analogy, when you look at the 3-digit number here, that first 1 in the first digit, that is going to represent the principle. And in this case, the principle is the perceivable principle. The 2nd digit is also a 1. In this case, the second one represents the guideline, and in this case, the guideline it's referring to as text alternatives. And then the third digit is also a 1 in this example, and this represents the specific success criterion, which is the non-text content. And so that's, in a nutshell, that's how you, I guess, decode or read the numbering system. So if you ever see a WCAG, standard or success criteria, and it's got that three-digit number separated by periods, you'll know that this is a specific success criterion, and you can use the individual digits there to determine whether or not it's a perceivable principle, operable, understandable, or robust principle. You can also refer to the second digit for the guideline. The third digit is going to give you the specific success criterion within that area. And I'll stop here now to see if there are any questions. Do we have any questions at this point?
Melanie, right now we don't have any questions, but I want to say kudos for just the way that you described the peeling the onions and the tiered numbering systems. Thank you for that. I know, even as Darren says, sometimes as experts we learn something new, and not that I learned anything new, but I look at it from a different perspective. So thank you for that. Really good.
Good. Appreciate that. All right, so we're going to move on to the conformance levels and talk about the A's. So I mentioned this earlier. There are 3 levels of conformance. The levels are cumulative, meaning that if a website meets conformance at a higher level, then it also would need to meet conformance at the lower level or lower levels. So the first, I guess the lowest level, the most basic level is the single A. This is going to address the most basic accessibility features to allow people with disabilities to access the content. If it's achieved, it means that the most basic requirements have been met for some people with disabilities. And using web content, I'm sorry, let me rephrase that. If it has been met, that means that the most basic requirements needed for some people with disabilities has been achieved, and most people should be able to access the most basic features of your website. AA is going to be your mid-level range, and it's also the most common level that is sought by higher ed institutions and also other entities. With this level, you're saying that you have met the standards for single A, your most basic accessibility features are there, but you're also addressing and have met some of the significant barriers that often are there for people with disabilities. They should have been eliminated and accessible. Third level is going to be your highest with the AAA. Honestly, at this time, I don't think most people are striving for complete AAA compliance. Occasionally, you may have someone who strives for AA, but maybe there are a few pieces within AAA that you want to address. But as I said, most people are really, the goal is trying to at least achieve full compliance at AA level. But with AAA, if it's achieved, it means that in addition to you meeting the requirements for single A and AA, you're also at this level, you're providing improvements and enhancements to web accessibility. All right, so moving on here, taking a look at just how WCAG is set up as it relates to the core principles and the success criteria. So here I've got a chart or a table The first column, there are 4 columns total. The first column shows the specific WCAG principle and also outlines the number of guidelines that are that exist within each principle. And then the other 3 columns show the number of success criteria that are required to be met at the various conformance level. And I highlighted columns 2 and 3 just to kind of show you the number of success criteria that would be needed if you wanted to achieve single A conformance and AA conformance. So if you were wanting to solely focus on single A, you've got 30 total success criteria that you would need to meet between those 4 principles, the 4 core principles. If you were going for AA conformance, you would have an additional 20. So you'd have to not only meet the 30 success criteria that fall within those 4 principles, you also would have an additional 20 that you would need to meet as well. And just want to remind you that the conformance level you're striving for will determine how many of these success criteria that you would actually need to address. As I mentioned before, there are a total of 78. So if you were, going for AAA level, you'd have 78 conformance or success criteria that you'd have to meet. All right, so now let's take a look at the core principles themselves. And the first one is perceivable. And remember, we're talking about the POUR acronym. And so the P in POUR stands for perceivable. And this focuses on the user being able to access information and interacting with the web interface, the components, just basically being able to access the content that's on the screen at the most basic level. And so with perceivable, you're really thinking about presenting your information and your content in multiple ways. Typically, it's going to be sight, touch, hearing. The user needs to be able to access your content with one of the senses. Okay. And so for perceivable, as I mentioned, there are 20 total success criteria that need to be addressed. There are 9 at the single A level, 11 at the AA level. And so here you're thinking about most frequently, or I guess most often, the area that most frequently comes up would be vision and hearing. And so a lot of the success criteria within the perceivable principle focuses on those types of issues that relate to sight and hearing, touch as well. And so some of the common issues that are addressed with perceivable, you have alt text for images, captions, and transcripts for video and audio recordings, color contrast, form labels, empty buttons, and headings are all pretty common issues that are addressed. Okay, so the second is operable. And going back to our acronym, the O in POUR stands for operable. And so here the focus is on using and operating web elements. This would be being able to interact and use either a mouse or keyboard to activate like links, your buttons, check boxes, edit fields, other form control fields, those types of things need to be able to be accessible either by mouse or by keyboard. Also being able to access other elements by the keyboard, things like headings, tables, images, all of those things, if they're accessible by keyboard, they help with navigation for people who aren't able to use a mouse to navigate. So content that is accessible by keyboard will also be operable by assistive technology equipment. And so basically this equipment will emulate the keyboard functionality. And here you have 17 total success criteria in operable, and there would be 14 for the single A and 3 for double A. And here we also show some of the more common issues that can be addressed. Keyboard only navigation, meaningful hyperlinks, headings, empty keyboard or empty buttons, and then also allowing enough time to complete a task. And I'm going to pause again to see if we have any questions so far. All right.
I'm sorry, I couldn't find my mute button. I apologize. So we actually do have a couple questions here. The first one is, if I met level AA conformance, does that mean I'm automatically met level A conformance by default?
I don't know if you would say by default. Well, in order to meet full AA conformance, then yes, you would. But I guess there could technically be a way for you to only focus on the AA criteria, which you wouldn't want to do. But if you're going to meet full AA conformance, then you're going to address the issues for single A and AA. So I guess it would just really depend on how you're going about doing that. A lot of people, excuse me, use a checklist that you can kind of keep up with the different, excuse me, that you can keep up with the different success criteria and make sure that you are addressing both a single A and AA.
Yes, that's very correct. And then I'd have to, similar question, I think it's worded a little bit different. If you met 10 of the perceivables, 13 is operables, et cetera, to get a total of 30, would you still get level A? So I think that's asking the same question. If you got 10 perceivables and 13 the operables, would you still get level A? Yeah,
it kind of sounds like it's a similar question, and it's really you're wanting to make sure that you are meeting. If you're only going for single A, then you're going to make sure that you're choosing the criteria that are identified as single A, and so those would be the ones you would address. And then if you are wanting to meet AA conformance, not only are you selecting those that are identified as single A, because you have to meet those, then you're also selecting the criteria that are listed as AA as well.
And a lot of times, too, just to piggyback off of what you're saying, is that a lot of times institutions, based on their policies, will have those standards set up so you have a guidance of which ones you need to meet. So that's very helpful for folks that are getting into WCAG for the first time. Is a lot of times there'll be policy that helps guide you on those standards.
Right, exactly.
Every school is different.
Yep.
One last question, and I love this question. It's actually a good one to think about. How long is the conformance rating valid for, or do you need to re-review every year?
So it does need to be, I guess, reviewed or evaluated regularly. Conformance is as good as the content. So, if you change your content, if you have videos on your web page that you had captions, you added captions to those, but then you change that video and you upload another one that doesn't. So then that web page is no longer, meets that the success criteria, the compliance level for that success criteria. So it depends on, how often your content is changing. As you change your content, then you want to also make sure that you are checking and evaluating the accessibility for the new content.
For example, we have scanning tools that, again, as Darren and others have said, are not the only way of testing for accessibility, but a good way to start. Those scan for us every 5 days, and it looks for new content. So yes, it is something that should be regularly checked based on the content. Yep.
Exactly.
That's all the questions for now.
Cool. All right, so moving on. So the third accessibility principle is understandable, and that is the U in the POUR acronym. And so this one focuses on having content and information presented in a way that is coherent and easy to understand. So users need to be able to understand the message that's being conveyed, and also should be able to easily follow the web page layout and navigation. And this can be achieved by using clear and simple language. Also making your message concise and to the point can also help with this. Also having an organized and consistent layout will make your web page more understandable to users. Having a predictable layout, which means the web page works the way that you would expect it to work. And it also works the same way that it worked on previous pages within the site. And that lets users know what to expect. They don't have to spend a lot of time trying to figure out how to use the page, which is especially important for someone with a disability. Having inconsistent or an unpredictable layout can be very challenging. So for AA conformance and for understandable, you have 10 success criteria. 5 are for single A, 5 for AA. And the issues that are typically addressed here, again, would be making content readable, providing predictable functionality, but also helping users avoid and correct mistakes is also one of the issues that the understandable principle addresses. And so the last principle in the POUR acronym is robust. And so this one, a lot of the criteria that are listed under this principle typically is not addressed by content creators, but more for those who are building the websites, like your web developers, those who are doing the coding and kind of the back end process for web content. And so with this one, the robust is focusing on being able to use content across different platforms, being able to be accessible from multiple browsers, mobile devices, and assistive technologies is key. As I said, this is typically handled by your web developers. There are a few principles that are, I guess, where a content creator may use, but for the most part, you're really looking more at your building and constructing your website. And some of the common issues: valid HTML, also the name and assigning roles and values to components are typically addressed through robust. And again, these are things that your coders and web developers are typically going to focus on. All right, so we're moving now into the common errors. And so the first one that I have here is alt text. And before I get into that, let me also mention with all of these errors that we're going to cover are typically, you find them most frequently on web pages, but you'll want to use those success criteria to check for and identify these errors. And also you use these to fix them, to fix those errors. So as I'm going through this, you'll notice if you are following along with the slides themselves, if you have them open, you can actually click on the links that are listed on these next few pages if you want to get more information about the specific success criteria. So with missing alternative text is one of the most common WCAG errors that we find in websites. An example of this would be you have an image or some sort of visual on your page, and there's no alternative text. There's no description in the alternative text field for that visual. And so this error falls under the success criteria 1.1.1, which is non-text content. And it is a single A conformance error. And again, kind of going back to the tiered numbering system, those first two digits, it represents the principle and also the guideline. And in this case, the guideline is text alternative. The main issue with this error, the image or that visual won't be available to someone who's using a screen reader, which means that important information or part or all of the message that you're trying to convey on your page won't be available to these users, and they will miss that information. And as I mentioned, this is an error that would fall under the perceivable principle. So the next one here, there are several success criteria that fall under this issue, and this is our form labels. So in form controls, these would be things like if you have a submit button, a radio button, check boxes, forward, back buttons, anything like that, where you're having to engage or enable something, and the web page is going to do something else as a result of that. When these types of form controls aren't properly labeled, they will be flagged as an error or WCAG error. And this occurs in the form controls when the label, sometimes there's nothing there, meaning that there's no text. There may be a label there, but there's no text within that label, or there may not be a label there at all. And so, as I said, this is going to be flagged under several principles and several success criteria. And this isn't uncommon to find an accessibility issue that would be an error under more than one success criteria. And this is because the issue a lot of times can affect more than one disability type, and it also could affect a specific disability type in more than one way. And so we've got 4 here that are listed, and I'm not going to go through all of these, but like I said, you can click on these to get additional information. But just to kind of point out, there are, we've got several two under the perceivable principle, 1 under the operable principle, and then 1 under the understandable principle. And so each of these, there's specific information. As you drill down, you can get additional information about how it affects that particular disability, disability type, and why it's important. So the main issue here is having that missing or improperly labeled form label. The function or the purpose of that button or radio, checkbox or edit field, the purpose is missing. And so someone who's using a screen reader won't know what that button is supposed to be for. What's the purpose of it? Why is it here? And this can certainly cause confusion with navigation, with, navigating through the site, trying to operate and, go through the site and the different features that are there. And also with understanding the web content not having these labels can be confusing. Okay, and I know we are close to time, so I'm going to share this this one about multimedia, and I'm probably will skip maybe the last few slides to get to my resources and have a few minutes for questions. So this one here focuses on multimedia, specifically missing captions and transcripts for multimedia. The issue here is not having the captions or transcripts for people who are deaf or hard of hearing. They basically won't be able to access the auditory content. This means that they'll miss part or all of the message that's being conveyed by audio. But also captions and transcripts help people with cognitive disabilities as well, because a lot of times they will use the text alternative that's available to help them understand the auditory content better. Okay, so I do have a slide about color contrast. Here, it's just basically saying that you want to have good contrast between the foreground and the background. The issue is mainly for those who have low vision. It makes it difficult to see what's on the screen. Okay, and like I said, I've got a few other examples here along with the links that you can go to for additional information. Just want to move here so we have at least a few minutes for questions. The resources page that I have here, I mentioned earlier that there was a checklist, or there are several checklists out there that many people use. The one that I have here is from Essential Accessibility. It lists the different principles, the success criteria, and the conformance level of each. And they separate them so that if you wanted to only focus on single A, you can. And then it moves to double A and then triple A. Also, the How to Meet WCAG, that is actually from the W3C, and it's a customizable reference guide, which you can go in and use that, and you can essentially, pick and choose how you want to, what standards or what guidelines you want to look at. It's a really great resource to use as well. And then this last one here is the Wave Accessibility Checker. This is a free evaluation tool. It's a Chrome extension. Really good for those who are just starting out with web accessibility and are wanting to have a free tool that you can use to test and check the accessibility of your web content. Now, it's not going to check everything. I think maybe about 30% of your WCAG errors would be flagged by an automated checker, but it is certainly a good tool and resource to use as you're getting started. Okay, so I'm gonna stop now and see if we have any additional questions.
Melanie, such a wonderful presentation. I really enjoyed it very much. There was a tool, there was a question that, I'm sorry about the train. I'm going to hear it for a second. Return. Sorry about that. That was going to be loud. There's a train passing by. There was a question that I know Kate is offering in there, but I wanted to see if you wanted to discuss more on different tools that will find common errors, scanning tools.
Discuss other scanning tools, automated accessibility checkers.
Yeah. Do you know of any other ones that might be helpful besides the weight one?
Yeah, there are others. I know DEQUE, and that's DEQUE, has a free checker, and I believe it's called AXE. AXE. That's another tool that could be used, and it's free. There are other automated tools out there that are available for a price. Cite Improve has one. I think there's Pope Tech, if I'm not mistaken, I think has one. There's several others that I cannot think of. It looks like someone has posted that North Carolina State uses Pope Tech. Monsido, I think that's spelled Monsido, is another one. And there are others out there as well that I can think of right now, but the ones that I've mentioned are probably about the same in terms of what they find. I think for some people, the setup maybe of how the tool works, some people prefer over others. But yeah, those are the ones that come to mind right off the top of my head.
One suggestion I can give to that, at UNC, we demoed a lot of different tools before we made a purchase of one, and you want to actually get stakeholders' feedback because they might just be looking more. They'll want accessibility, obviously, but some of these tools do more, such as broken links and quality assurance. And so you want to find a tool that works best for your campus. One thing I know most of us do as experts, we don't go, well, they're using it, so that means we have to get it. That's not always the case. They might be very comparable tools, but you want to see what works on your campus too. So yeah,
right.
Good suggestions.
And it's all about the usability, and you know, like Brad said, what works for one may not work for everyone else. But and certainly if you're able to purchase a tool, it would be a good idea to get some feedback from those who would actually be using it.
Well, I hate to cut you off. There was, like I said, a wonderful presentation there, and so hopefully people will go back to the recordings as well as look at the resources that you provided in your slides. We're going to go ahead and close put up the closing slide here, and I think Sarah might be doing that right now.